I'll start with the premise that every IGC country has the talent to have a vibrant private sector. And the challenge is to allocate the right people to key positions in firms and to allocate the talent to the private sector rather than exclusively the other sectors in the economy, and then incentivizing that talent to be productive and to make investments and to constantly improve themselves. And I want to ask, what does research say about either of these two statements? So first of all, on managerial talent, first thing I want to ask is what matters and what do we know from research about what matters? And so, there are at least two possibilities. One is that it's just innate ability, it's entrepreneurial ability, it's something in the ethers about people. And the other is that actually it's not just entrepreneurial ability, it's also managerial ability or management practices. And I'm sitting in front of the godfather of management practice measurement in the last and the advancements that we've made in the last 10 years. A large part of it from John Van Reenen and based on the work of John Van Reenen and Nick Bloom. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of research projects. One on small firms, and I'm going to say a bit more about small firms than large firms in my presentation, in part because I think the work on management practices in large firms and some of these issues in large firms is somewhat better known and better understood, and in part because some of the later presentations will focus, I think, more on somewhat larger firms. I think the takeaway that we're beginning to see from some of this research is that both ability, broadly measured with general education levels, intelligence tests, and things like that, and management practices, both matter, and they matter somewhat surprisingly, somewhat independently, even though the two are correlated with one another, and they matter in roughly equal proportions. And I'll give sort of two examples from that. I'll spend a bit more time on the first. Again, it's small firms. It's also my research. I have the raw data and the ability to dig into it a bit more. But so this is from some work that I've done with David McKenzie on business practices in very small firms, and very much this is influenced by John and Nick's work on measuring management practices in larger firms. But we take a very different set of questions than they do, because these are firms largely without employees, so we can't focus on HR practices because there aren't employees to do that. Instead, we focus on these four areas: marketing, buying and stock control, record keeping, and financial planning. And these are the questions are largely taken from what the International Labor Organization teaches in its standard Start and Improve Your Business program, the standard sort of, which is without a doubt the largest and most broadly implemented entrepreneurship training program for small-scale micro enterprises around the world. What I have here is a couple of graphs that just say, look, we see in terms of distributions of these management practices, for those of you who've seen Nick and John's slides on these, we see graphs that look a lot like what they get. Big distributions, wide distributions, some very well, some firms that are doing a lot of these practices, some firms that aren't doing many at all, and we see that these practices are correlated with firm size. They're also correlated with firm growth, with exit, and so forth. So in the same sort of cross-sectional way that the original Bloom and Reenen work finds, we find these practices are correlated with firms. And so this is that in a regression framework that says, that whether we look at labor productivity or TFP, we get a very important component, that management business practices matter, and that they have an effect. And I think, given that these are very small firms and the owner is the manager, we worried a lot about these aren't markets in which there's a market for managerial skills. These are individuals, and we could worry a lot about management practices being correlated with other kinds of ability, and all this is doing is just picking up those ability measures rather rather than being about practices themselves. Not surprisingly, these practices are correlated with education levels or even test scores, other kinds of measures of ability. What's a bit more surprising is that even when you put these other measures in, not only are these correlated with this, they're both correlated with outcomes in the firm, and they seem to be correlated in kind of an independent way. That is, the inclusion of these measures of ability don't really affect very much the magnitude of the effect of management practices, and vice versa. I'm not showing vice versa, but if I leave out management practices and put in, I don't see much in the way of changes in these. So these things seem to be operating somewhat independently. When you look at sort of standard deviation changes in these things, one standard deviation change in management practice is associated with about a 22% increase in TFP. It's 26% if ability is not included. And a one standard deviation change in each of the three ownerability measures that I showed there is associated with about an 18% change in size. And so, these are roughly equal proportions, and they're roughly independent of one another. And I think that's the takeaway I would take from this. And we see something similar in what's out there on large firms as well. And there's one very nice example. This is a project with very much a genesis at IGC, because it started with some work in India that IGC funded. A paper by Bandiera, Henson, Pratt, and Sadoun that looks at data from CEO diaries, where they do a week-long time use survey of CEOs in 6 countries, and they use that to create an index of CEO behavior, and then sort of rank these CEO behaviors in quite sophisticated ways. I mean, I first saw this paper when it was just a description of the time use, which was very interesting and novel, perhaps not entirely compelling. The paper now I find entirely compelling and very interesting, and a lot of it has to do with this part of the exercise. And they then go through in places where they have the data to do both, look at both management practices and CEO performance, and they find something quite similar. The two operate somewhat independently. They have essentially equal magnitudes and so forth. So both of these things seem to matter. And an aside to this point at this point in time is that using the cross-region, cross-country data, they conclude that matching frictions, the way the markets work for matching CEOs to firms, this is a quote from them, may account for a sizable fraction of the cross-country productivity differential observed in these data. So there's a sense in which we're going to say both of these things matter, and if we want to think about what we can do about the manager fixed characteristics, or what I'll think of as the manager fixed characteristics, innate ability and so forth, that's going to be about selection and allocation, and that's where I think this comment, the last comment that I had on the last slide is relevant, is we want to think about allocation and selection. How do we identify entrepreneurs with high entrepreneurial ability? And the managerial practice, management practice might be either management fixed, or they might be pliable, they might be changeable, it might be something that we can adjust through training. This sort of suggests we want to think about 2 areas. One is allocation, selection, how people get allocated to different factors, and the other is what do we know about changing management practice, about changing entrepreneurial ability and the effects of training. So I'll take these sort of one at a time. The first on selection, on identifying entrepreneurs with more potential. There's several different attempts to do this, and again, I'm going to focus mainly on small firms in this part. But for large firms, I think when we look in lower and low middle income countries, we are seeing sort of an increasing penetration of private equity, venture capital, these kinds of things, and of course that's what they do. They look for people with high growth potential. That's the big part of the game, and people that they both have the potential innately, and that they can provide assistance and help and as it were training and connection grow. At a smaller scale, there are a few projects out there that are looking at how do we use information from communities about who it is who might, among micro-entrepreneurs, have the potential to scale up a bit, not to become massive exporters, but to scale up a bit. The project is using information from communities about identifying who the faster growth entrepreneurs are. The second project is a project that's ongoing, that's looking at scaling up micro-entrepreneurs, people who are successful borrowers from MFIs. In this case, it's finally being implemented in Egypt after floating around several different countries. It's being implemented in Egypt, looking at scaling up successful borrowers from MFIs and moving them on to larger scale loans and with more formal banks. So again, using information from the MFI in this case about who is it has potential to handle a larger loan and so forth. So there's work that's being done looking at non-cognitive measures, and Bailey Klinger and Asim Khwaja have and the Entrepreneur Finance Lab have done quite a lot with psychometric testing. Again, working largely with clients of micro lenders and data from micro lenders and looking at the effects of that. Then I want to say something a bit more about several attempts using business plan competitions to identify high growth entrepreneurs, and I think these kind of serve potentially two purposes. One is that they help identify fast growing entrepreneurs. The other is they provide publicity. Maybe they help make entrepreneurship cool in places, and I think that's quite important. I mean, one of the issues with allocation, if we think about allocation of talent, it's not just allocation of talent across firms and within the private sector. Surveys we've conducted in Sri Lanka suggest when you ask parents what their aspirations for children are, everybody wants their kids to work for the government. When you go lots of countries, the best jobs, government, NGOs, foreign aid agencies, high paid, secure, good pensions, and so forth. Now, it's not that we don't need talent in those sectors, but perhaps there's an over-allocation of talent to those sectors and not enough to the private sector. And I think one of the things that business plan competitions do is to try to draw people back from those sectors into the private sector, people with business ideas. So in any case, there are a few things, things out there. Bailey Klinger and Matthias Schindlin have a paper in Central America that uses an RD design to look at a business plan competition that TechnoServe runs, and shows that those who are rated higher are more likely to start a business. These are people who don't currently have a business who are in the competition. I have a paper with Marcel Fashans where we look at existing business owners and who has the potential to scale up. Now, our project, as with a lot of these projects, is not purely about selection. It's about the combination of selection and some prize, because to draw people into the competition, we give a prize to winners. In our case, the prize is training. Fortunately for these purposes, we find training has zero effect. Doesn't do anything at all for anybody. So we can sort of, look at it. We think we can look at it again as just a pure selection thing. We find that both panels and surveys are able to predict to some extent who it is who grows more quickly. Marcel and Simon Quinn have a project, again, using competitions and scoring, but also offering a $1,000 prize to winners. They find that leads to more entry, higher profits. And then the big kahuna of all of these, David McKenzie has this project that he's done, evaluated he's evaluated, because it's a government project, in Nigeria, evaluating the UN project, which is youth under 40, youth entrepreneurship program, business plan competition. It seems pretty youthful to me, but lots of people, maybe 40 is pushing it for youth. But a youth business plan competition in Nigeria. In this case, there's a competition, and the winners get $50,000 each So this is a massive amount of a capital shock, right? So we can look at selection, we can look at kind of what's happening, but really when we think about the outcomes of this is what's going to be driving a lot, this massive scale grant. So most of these are hybrids between selection and relaxing and constraint. That's, in one sense, not so bad, because what's the purpose of doing selection? It's partly so you can allocate resources to the right, the scarce resources, training resources and other things, to the right firms. But from an academic perspective, we might like to be able to understand how we separate these things. How do we separate selection from the constraints themselves? So this is basically David's design, that the contest gets about 24,000 applicants. Only about 15% are from existing firms. Most are potential applicants. There's an initial 10-minute screen to select 5,000 of them, heavily focused on the existing businesses rather than the selection is skewed towards the existing businesses and away from the entrants. Then they're trained for 4 days to write a business plan, and then they write this business plan, and that's reviewed much more extensively. So of the 5,000 selected, almost all of them submit a business plan. They're scored. They take the top 2,400, half of that sample, and they divide them into basically 4 groups. There's a group that is deemed to be not very good at all, and they're dropped. There are groups that are the best in the country or the best in a region, and they're awarded the prize immediately. And then there's a fairly large group in the middle, which are randomly allocated prizes. Either they get the prize or they don't at random. So now we've got a group, and we should think about what the late is here, but because it's not the best people, but it's this middle group, and we're getting a different, some of them get $50,000 and some don't. And what happens, well, among the existing firms, we see this is basically 6 months after the last tranche of payments, and this is a year and a half later. We see a pretty substantial and certainly significant increase in the likelihood the firm has more than 10 employees. They're also sort of standard employment effects, but they're visually clearest in this. And then among entrants, the same thing. Now, as partly this is actually not selection. This is entirely the effect of the grant, but the effect of the grant on a selected sample. Just to note that this amounts to about $8,300 per job created. Turns out that, although that sounds like a big number, it compares pretty favorably to these sorts of things that are grants and so forth for job creation, or tax rebates for job creation in the U.S. and Europe, where we have it.
Sorry, what was the cost per job created of the program?
80.
The 8,000, that's the good thing, but how much did it cost the British taxpayer? What was the cost of the program to achieve that?
That's it. So that's the cost of the program divided by the number of jobs created.
Okay.
That's where the 8,350 comes from.
That's the cost.
That's the cost. That's the total cost of running this thing, including not the research part, but the total cost of running the grant the competition plus the grants awarded, divided by the number of jobs that were created, taking the difference between treatment and control.
So that's the same in the US and Europe, but not in PPPs.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, that's what I wanted.
That's right. We also have there are also some examples out there of combinations of selection and training, and I think one of these I find interesting was actually Steve Anderson McDonald presented this last year at Growth Week. The Anderson McDonald, Chandri and Zia paper in South Africa, which is a training. It's an outlier in the training literature in terms of finding effects and finding big effects of training in relatively small firms. And there are 2 reasons it could be an outlier, and again, it's a little frustrating that we can't separate these 2 reasons, but one is that they provide, it's an RCT, but they randomize on a selected sample because they require multiple visits from the entrepreneur to the center to register for this thing. So that's going to screen out people everybody who's not really interested in the training, and there are no subsidies for training. So they get this sort of somewhat screens, and they also have they also screen on responses to survey questions and so forth as well. So they have this sort of selected sample, and they get quite strong effects of training, quite strongly positive effects of training. And again, the training itself is quite different from the typical ILO training class or freedom from hunger class, which are more typically offered 8 hours a day for some number of consecutive days. This is focusing on one aspect of management, marketing, or finance. And it's done over longer periods of time, one day at a time with homework in between. So there's both a difference in the training model and a selected sample, and an outlier in terms of effects. My suspicion is that the selection has something to do with it. The training may also be explaining part of it. And then work that Eric and David Atkin and others are doing in progress working on an innovation prize competition, in which, again, trying to identify firms with innovative ideas in Pakistan, which is a similar kind of thing of a combination of a prize and a selection process. So, again, I would say that selection may be important is that to efficiently channel the resources to the right places, and ideally we'd like to be able to unpack these two things, unpack the differences between these. So, in the last few minutes, let me just say a couple of two more points to make. One is, can we improve management practices? Well, one notable success is the work that Nick Bloom and others have done in India with the Indian large textile plants. This is, one of the few examples in really large factories. There's the intensity of treatment here. Even if I linearly scale this for size, it's much more intense than most of what we do in small scale firms. So $250,000. These are several hundred employees. So that would be $2,500 for a firm with several employees. Typically, the training programs that we're implementing, ILO and so forth, are more on the order of $250. So it's per participant. So it's a bigger scale thing. Training is arguably more important in smaller firms because there's no management market. We can't go out and get a manager in these firms. There are pockets of success. The one I've already mentioned, Greg and Antoinette Shore and Antonio Drexler have a nice paper looking at very simple training that seems to have positive effects on small firms. One thing to note about these is these are all, the ones that are successful here are all using some model which is different from the model of training, which is typically, most typically implemented around the world. None of these are using the ILO's standard sort of start and Purdue business training program, and on that we have less evidence of effectiveness in terms of firm growth. The other comment to make about this, they're all very idiosyncratic, and from a policy perspective, it'd be nice to have replications of some of these. So the last point I want to make is that a lot of this research thinks about relaxing constraints. It's supply driven, and this is a cartoon of it's an emergency employment, and people standing up with string here, 1, 2, 3, push. So that's relaxing the supply constraint. But possibly it's not about the supply constraint, possibly it's about demand. And I think there are a couple of very nice papers. First of all, there's suggestive evidence from Nick and John's paper in 2007 that places that have more competitive markets have better management practices, and at least in the cross-section, there's, that seems to be the case. There are a couple of really nice sort of experiments in changing markets and changing market incentives and market structures. One is Dravidas Quadra. It's actually schools in Pakistan, but these are largely private schools where they provide report cards, information about the quality of schools in local communities, finding quite dramatic effects on quality of the low performers and on prices of the high performers. So that's a suggestion that changing the information flows in markets might have an effect. And the other is David Economy and Adam Osman's project on linking independent rug makers in Egypt with export markets. And again, we see quite dramatic effects on productivity and quality and so forth. These are both demand-focused programs. We're going to change the market structure, we're going to change the demand, we're going to leave it to the people, the entrepreneurs, and the markets to figure out how to do this stuff on their own, rather than trying to affect supply. And I think, there's no supply side intervention in either of these cases. Now, these guys are kind of going back and saying, let's see if we can bundle this with capital and see what happens when we allow firms to have access to more capital. Are the effects bigger? So just to conclude, I think innovations in measuring management help us understand and separate the roles of management practices on the one hand and other kinds of ability that might be affected by selection and so forth. And it seems that both of these matters. Both of these matter. And the points, this points to a need for understanding in two dimensions. One is this selection allocation of individuals, entrepreneurship, and across sectors, not just within the private sector, but across private sector and other sectors. And the second is improving management practices. And then the last is, necessities of other intervention. These demand side interventions, I think, deserve somewhat more attention. I think we've put a lot of attention on the supply side. I think the demand side, deserves more attention. And particularly, we really need more understanding of how markets work at a microstructure, market structure level. And Dilip has some work with others on potato markets in India. There's Marshall Burke and Warwick have a project in Kenya on grain markets and so forth. These are things that really trying to understand how traders have an effect on how these markets work and how that affects incentives for producers in those markets. So in terms of an area where I think there's been less work that we want to think more carefully about is on the demand side. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.